While hundreds of thousands of people were instantly vaporized by the sudden, terrifying birth of the atomic age, one man managed to outrun the blinding flash of a nuclear sun not just once, but twice, surviving the absolute extremes of physics, thermal geometry, and human biology to eventually die of old age at 93. It was the morning of August 6, 1945, and Tsutomu Yamaguchi was simply a man trying to finish a business trip so he could go home to his wife and infant son. He was a 29-year-old naval engineer working for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, and he had spent the last 3 months in Hiroshima designing oil tankers, a job that felt increasingly futile as the war dragged on and resources dwindled. He was actually walking toward the shipyard for his final day of work, his bags already packed, when he heard the drone of an aircraft engine high above the city. He looked up into the clear blue sky and saw a single American B-29 bomber soaring in the stratosphere, and moments later, he noticed two small parachutes drifting down toward the Earth. What he didn't know, and what no human being on the planet outside of a highly classified circle of scientists and military officials knew, was that he was looking at the intricate firing mechanism of a weapon that was about to permanently alter the course of human history. The parachutes were attached to diagnostic equipment, but the main payload, a uranium-235 gun-type fission bomb nicknamed Little Boy, was in freefall. When the bomb reached an altitude of exactly 1,900 feet above the surgical clinic it was targeting, a conventional explosive charge inside the steel casing fired a hollow cylinder of uranium into a solid spike of the same material. This forced the uranium into a supercritical mass, therefore initiating an uncontrolled chain reaction where neutrons smashed into atomic nuclei, splitting them apart, releasing more neutrons, which split more nuclei, doubling in energy every few millionths of a second. This terrifying cascade of subatomic violence transformed the mass of the bomb into a sphere of plasma hotter than the core of the sun, and the very first thing Yamaguchi experienced was the light. It was a flash so unimaginably bright that it seemed to bleach the entire world of color, a phenomenon the Japanese survivors would later call the pika. This wasn't just light, but an intense wave of thermal radiation traveling at the speed of light, carrying enough heat to instantly carbonize human flesh, melt roof tiles, and spontaneously ignite anything flammable within a 2-mile radius. Because thermal radiation behaves like light, it travels in straight lines, meaning it casts shadows, and if you're standing in the open, your body absorbs the full, lethal spectrum of that heat. But Yamaguchi was roughly 3 kilometers away from ground zero, and in the split second the sky erupted, his naval training kicked in. He dove toward a muddy irrigation ditch in a nearby potato patch, thrusting his fingers over his eyes and plugging his ears with his thumbs, pressing his body as flat as possible against the earth. This immediate, instinctive dive into the dirt is likely the first reason his wife didn't become a widow that day. By getting into the ditch, he placed the lip of the earth between his body and the hypocenter of the explosion, effectively cutting off the direct line of sight to the thermal pulse. The heat scorched his upper body, burning the left side of his face and his forearms, but the ditch shielded him from the worst of the searing flash. But surviving the heat is only the first fraction of a second of a nuclear detonation, because immediately after the flash comes the dawn, the devastating acoustic and physical shockwave. When the atmosphere is superheated by a nuclear fireball, the air expands violently outward in every direction, creating a wall of highly compressed air moving at supersonic speeds. Think of it like dropping a massive boulder into a calm pond, where the water is violently displaced in a rapidly expanding ring, except this ring is made of atmospheric pressure so dense it can snap steel girders and flatten concrete buildings like a house of cards. Furthermore, as this primary shockwave hits the ground, it bounces back up and merges with the trailing wave, creating something called a Mach stem, a reinforced vertical wall of pressure that sweeps across the landscape with magnified destructive force. This invisible wall of displaced atmosphere hit Yamaguchi's position a few seconds after the flash, entirely ignoring the shallow protection of his ditch. The pressure wave scooped him up like a dry leaf, tossing him violently into the air, tumbling him head over heels until he slammed back into the dirt, battered, bruised, and temporarily blinded. His eardrums were ruptured by the sudden, extreme fluctuation in atmospheric pressure, a common injury for survivors, as the human ear is incredibly sensitive to rapid barometric shifts. He lay there in the mud, half-conscious, the world having gone completely dark. The sudden darkness wasn't because he was entirely blind, but because the detonation had sucked thousands of tons of dirt, dust, pulverized buildings, and ash into the sky, creating a dense, towering mushroom cloud that literally blotted out the morning sun. The air was filled with a suffocating twilight, and soon, thick, greasy drops of black rain began to fall. This black rain was a terrifying mixture of atmospheric moisture, carbonized debris from the burning city, and highly radioactive fission products falling back to Earth, coating everything and everyone in a toxic, invisible poison. Yamaguchi survived the initial blast, the thermal pulse, and the physical trauma, but his nightmare was only beginning. He spent the night in an air raid shelter with his colleagues, surrounded by the moans of the dying and the smell of roasted flesh, trying to comprehend an event that defied all human logic. But amidst the chaos and the horror, he had a single, overriding thought, which was that he had to get home to his wife and his baby boy in Nagasaki. Therefore, the very next morning, wrapped in bandages, his hearing muffled and his skin throbbing with radiation burns, he navigated the apocalyptic ruins of Hiroshima. He had to cross a river completely choked with floating, swollen corpses just to reach the train station, exposing himself to vast amounts of residual radiation lingering in the dust and the water. Miraculously, a few trains were still operating on the outskirts of the city, packed with traumatized, injured survivors fleeing the devastation. He boarded a train and began the long, agonizing journey south, bringing the horrors of the atomic age with him in his own irradiated cells. He arrived in Nagasaki on August 8th, a shattered man returning to a city that was still blissfully unaware of the new reality of warfare. He received treatment for his burns at a local hospital, his body already fighting the silent, invisible war of acute radiation exposure, but he was alive and he was home. You would think a man who had just survived the most destructive weapon ever unleashed would stay in bed, but duty and corporate culture ran deep. So on the morning of August 9th, Tsutomu Yamaguchi reported for work at the Mitsubishi Heavy Industry offices in Nagasaki. His bandages covered his face and arms, and he was clearly in pain, but he sat down with his company director to explain exactly what had happened to their shipyard in Hiroshima. The director listened to Yamaguchi's wild tale of a single flash of light instantly melting a bustling metropolis, but he simply could not process the physics being described to him. The director told Yamaguchi he was crazy, that it was scientifically impossible for one bomb to destroy an entire city, and that the trauma must have addled his brain. And it was at that exact moment, at 11 o'clock and 2 minutes in the morning, as if summoned by the director's disbelief, that the room was suddenly flooded by an overwhelming, blinding white light. It was happening again. But this time the physics were different, and the bomb was significantly more powerful. The American bomber Boxcar had dropped Fat Man, a plutonium implosion device that was a fundamentally more complex and destructive weapon than the uranium bomb used on Hiroshima. Instead of firing two pieces of metal together, Fat Man used a sphere of subcritical plutonium, surrounded by an intricate shell of high explosive lenses. When triggered, these conventional explosives detonated simultaneously, creating a perfectly symmetrical inward-driving shockwave that squeezed the solid plutonium core down to the size of a marble, radically increasing its density and initiating the nuclear chain reaction. The resulting explosion released 21 kilotons of energy, roughly 40% more powerful than the bomb that had destroyed Hiroshima. Yamaguchi was once again roughly 3 kilometers from the hypocenter, a hauntingly exact repetition of his spatial relationship to the apocalypse. But this time, his survival relied on a completely different set of physical and architectural variables. He was not in a potato patch, but inside a heavily reinforced concrete office building. When the blinding flash filled the room, Yamaguchi instantly recognized the signature of the pica, and he threw himself to the floor, once again adopting the protective posture he had used 3 days earlier. The shockwave hit the building with the force of a hurricane made of solid rock, shattering the windows, blowing the doors off their hinges, and sending razor-sharp shards of glass flying through the air like shrapnel. The office was instantly shredded, the ceiling collapsing and the walls buckling under the massive overpressure, but the reinforced concrete skeleton of the Mitsubishi building held. This is a crucial detail of atomic survival, because concrete is incredibly dense, and its mass acts as a highly effective sponge for both thermal heat and ionizing radiation. Gamma rays and neutrons, the deadly subatomic particles released by the fission process, lose energy as they collide with the dense atomic structure of materials like lead, steel, or thick concrete. If Yamaguchi had been standing in a traditional Japanese wooden structure, the gamma radiation would have passed right through the paper and thin wood, shredding his cellular structure. But the heavy concrete walls of the office building absorbed a massive percentage of the initial radiation burst, acting as an unintentional, life-saving shield. Furthermore, the topography of Nagasaki itself played a massive role in the survival of the wider city, and by extension, Yamaguchi's family. Unlike Hiroshima, which was built on a flat, open river delta that allowed the shockwave to expand evenly in a perfect, devastating circle, Nagasaki is nestled in a series of deep valleys surrounded by steep mountains. When the Fat Man bomb detonated over the Urakami Valley, the surrounding hills acted as massive geographical blast shields. Think of water flowing rapidly down a narrow, rocky canyon. The water bounces off the walls, its energy contained and channeled, rather than spreading out evenly. The shockwave slammed into the mountainsides, reflecting back upon itself and confining the absolute worst of the destruction to the specific valley below the blast. Because of this rugged terrain, large portions of the city, including the area where Yamaguchi's wife and child were waiting for him, were protected from the direct line of fire. Yamaguchi pulled himself out of the wreckage of the office building, his Hiroshima bandages now torn and bleeding, facing the impossible reality that he had just survived a second nuclear strike. He rushed through the newly ruined city, navigating a familiar, hellish landscape of flattened buildings and raging fires, terrified that his family was dead. But when he finally reached his neighborhood, he found his house damaged but standing, and his wife and infant son alive, saved by the geographical lottery of the Nagasaki hills. Yet the physical survival of the blasts was only the prologue to the biological horror story that was about to unfold inside his own body. Yamaguchi had now been subjected to 2 separate doses of intense, ionizing radiation within a 72-hour period. To understand what this means, we have to look away from the macro destruction of buildings and examine the microscopic destruction happening inside his cells. Ionizing radiation, specifically the gamma rays and high-energy neutrons emitted by a nuclear blast, carries so much energy that it can physically knock electrons out of their orbits around atoms. When these microscopic bullets tear through human tissue, they collide directly with the DNA molecules housed inside the nucleus of every single cell. DNA is essentially the master blueprint of the human body, a delicate, tightly wound spiral staircase made of sugar phosphate backbones and nucleotide base pairs. When a gamma ray hits this structure, it can snap one side of the staircase, which the body can usually fix, but a massive dose of radiation causes double-strand breaks, snapping the entire staircase in half. Imagine a vast library containing millions of complex instruction manuals for how to build and maintain a city, and then imagine someone throwing a localized firebomb into the center of the room. The body has incredibly complex biological librarians, specialized enzymes and proteins like P53, whose entire job is to rush to the site of the damage, halt the cell's replication cycle, and attempt to retape the torn blueprints back together. But Yamaguchi's body had been bombarded twice. The biological librarians were entirely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of broken DNA strands. When the repair mechanisms fail, or when they hastily tape the wrong strands of DNA together, the cell either mutates, potentially leading to cancer decades later, or it simply initiates apoptosis, essentially programmed cell suicide. In the days following the Nagasaki bombing, Yamaguchi's body began to crash as billions of his cells simply stopped dividing and died. His hair began to fall out in large clumps, a classic sign of acute radiation syndrome, because hair follicles are among the fastest dividing cells in the human body, making them extremely vulnerable to radiation damage. The lining of his stomach and intestines, which also rely on rapid cellular turnover, began to slough off, leading to severe nausea, vomiting, and inability to digest food. Most dangerously, the radiation penetrated deep into the marrow of his bones, the biological factory responsible for producing white blood cells. His leukocyte count plummeted, effectively shutting down his immune system and leaving him completely defenseless against even the mildest of infections. He lay in a shelter with his family, running a high fever, his Hiroshima burns refusing to heal, teetering on the absolute edge of biological collapse. It is a profound mystery of human physiology why Yamaguchi's bone marrow did not fail completely, why a small reservoir of resilient stem cells hidden deep in the cavities of his femurs and pelvis managed to survive the double barrage of gamma radiation. Perhaps it was the angle he was standing at, perhaps it was the shielding of the concrete building, or perhaps he simply possessed an incredibly robust genetic repair mechanism that worked overtime to rebuild his blood supply. Slowly, agonizingly, over the course of weeks and months, the fever broke. His bone marrow began to pump out fresh white blood cells, fighting off the infections that threatened to overwhelm him. His skin began to scar over the deep thermal burns, and his digestive tract slowly repaired its delicate lining. He survived the immediate trauma, he survived the acute radiation sickness, and he lived to see the rebuilding of Japan. He went back to work for Mitsubishi, designing oil tankers again, as if the world hadn't ended twice right in front of him. For decades, he lived a relatively quiet life, raising his family, dealing with the permanent deafness in his left ear and the heavy, emotional burden of his memories, but physically, his body held together. It wasn't until his later years, when he was in his 80s, that he began to suffer from radiation-related ailments, eventually developing stomach cancer, a cruel but scientifically predictable delayed consequence of the mutated DNA resting silently in his cells for over half a century. But even then, he defied the odds, surviving the cancer and living to be 93 years old, becoming one of the most vocal advocates for total nuclear disarmament in the world. His life is a staggering intersection of human anatomy, architectural shielding, topographical luck, and the brutal, unforgiving mechanics of nuclear physics. The fact that he was mathematically positioned in the exact right place, at the exact right time, in 2 different cities, to survive the deadliest weapon ever created by a species determined to destroy itself, suggests that human resilience is sometimes stronger than the math designed to end it. He proved that even when the sky splits open and the very fabric of the atom is turned into a weapon of mass annihilation, the human body, under the most impossibly rare conditions, can still find a way to quietly put itself back together.